Witch in Charm's Way, a cozy mystery audio book, written and narrated by R.K. Dreaming. Part 3.
"Customers," she trilled. "Customers? Well, who do you think I was baking all these cakes for, dear?" she said. "Everybody always loved my cakes. I've decided to keep my cafe open." My mouth dropped open. But... I didn't know what to say. Aunt Adele had run a cafe called Dell's Delights out of the castle during her lifetime, named so by her adoring husband. She had been particularly gifted at kitchen magic, and my cousins and I had always been envious when our school friends had told us of all the delicious things they had eaten at Aunt Adele's cafe, which we were forbidden to visit. "The tourists are going to love it," she said gleefully. Tourists! So that's why she was wearing that ridiculous stuff. She was trying to pass herself off as being alive for the sake of the Humbles. "Although, I suppose there won't be many of them here now it's gotten so cold," she said regretfully. She did not seem to care that revealing her ghostly self was the same as revealing magic to Humbles, which was a breach of the International Magical Secrecy Pact. And now she was dead, so it was me who'd be getting in trouble for it. She slapped a big, floppy-brimmed witch's hat over her head and floated towards the door. I snatched up her forgotten sunglasses and raced after her. "Wait," I cried out. "I'll let them in. You stay in the kitchen until we, perfect your disguise." She halted and looked thoughtfully at me. Spotting her sunglasses in my hand, she looked a little bit contrite. "I suppose that might be a good idea. You may as well put yourself to some use. Off you pop." Humming to herself, she returned to the oven. I opened the second door she had been about to go through and flinched. On the other side was Dell's Delights Cafe, and it was in a glass conservatory. The large glass structure was attached to the castle, and outside it I could see one of the castle gardens. I gazed out at all that glass in dismay. I was glad to see the sky outside was overcast and grey. I winced as I stepped forward into the milky light. Immediately I felt a tingling burning on my face and hands that made me feel itchy all over. My sunblock might be holding up for now, but my every instinct told me to run away. But I couldn't. The people outside the cafe had already spotted me through the glass. One of them was waving at me. I made my way to the cafe door. Through the frosted glass, I made out a group of 5 people standing outside. When I let them in, I was pleased to see that they were not Humbles. Brimstone Bay was the only entirely magical and eldritch town in all of England. The only Humbles we got were tourists. These were young locals. I recognised a couple of them, especially since one of them was fairly famous here. He was the Dampire Oberon Malte Jr., a day walker. I recognised him by his distinctive widow's peak, that dark hair and those intense green eyes. The last time I had seen him, he must have been only 7 or 8. It was so odd to see him all grown up, a man now. I didn't know how I felt about his arrival. Seeing him put me a little on edge, and not for the reasons you would think. Vampires didn't have the best of reputations, not even here in Brimstone Bay. Oberon's dad was the vampire patriarch, Oberon Malte Sr., one of Brimstone Bay's wealthiest and most important residents, a charming billionaire and a ladies' man, and yet highly feared by many. Despite who his father was, as a little kid, Oberon Jr., the Dampire, had always been playful and cute and very well liked in town. He hadn't bitten a single soul, not even in nursery school, so they said. He had clearly grown up to be an affable adult too, going by the warm smile he offered me as he led the way in. "Oh good, you're open," he exclaimed. "I've missed Dell's cakes." His friends followed him in. 2 guys, 2 girls, all very pretty people. I bet at school they had been a popular bunch. The quintet were pink-cheeked from the outdoors, as if they had hiked up the cliffside to get here from the beach. The castle stood near a cliff edge that overlooked Brimstone Bay beach below. The other one I had recognised was Lorcan Hardwick. He had been the little golden-haired kid always running around with Oberon back then. He was little no more. He looked very much like his big sister, who I'd had the great misfortune of being in school with. Lorcan had a surprised expression on his face as he scrutinised me. I had got rid of my scarf in the warmth of the kitchen, and so my face was on show. He hadn't recognised me for a Westbrim, though, or he wouldn't be looking me up and down in that not too unflattering manner. A bit appreciatively, I thought. I didn't know whether I was offended or amused. He wouldn't have been looking at me like that a week ago. The single positive side effect of my new unwanted condition was that it had increased my metabolism to the point that I, who had been more than a little plump my whole life, had lost an impossible number of pounds this past week. My first glimpse of my newly svelte self in the mirror had been a shock. That was another thing I was glad of, still having a reflection. The loss of it would have been very difficult to explain. Lorcan Hardwick's momentary appreciation was better than his displeasure, I supposed. Any Hardwick was going to be furious about me inheriting Manor House. Clearly, he did not know that little nugget yet. I showed the 5 to a table, handed them some menus, and retreated to a blissfully shady spot behind the counter. As they enthusiastically considered their choices, I considered them. I was glad to see they were taking more of an interest in their food options than in me. The 3 others in their group were unfamiliar to me, which wasn't surprising given how long I'd been away. My instinct for species told me that 2 of them were Baiina, an incubus and succubus. The shade of their blonde hair was an exact match, and their long, elegant faces were very similar, despite one being a guy and one being a girl. I figured they must be siblings. This was confirmed when I overheard Oberon referring to them as twins. The last one in the group was one of the most gorgeous girls I had ever seen in my life. She had blonde hair so pale it was almost silver, big eyes so blue that they were almost purple, and rosy cheeks and a rosebud mouth and a figure to die for. She was much prettier than the succubus, which was saying something, and yet she didn't seem to be a succubus herself as far as I could tell. Even so, all 3 of the guys she was with could barely keep their eyes off her, but she only had eyes for the menu. She leaned towards Oberon as he told her which were his favourite desserts. Lorcan Hardwick and the incubus watched them with obvious jealousy. The incubus looked like he wished he could use his allure on the gorgeous girl, but that would have been beyond rude. Allure was a magical gift that Baiina were born with, which they could use to make them irresistibly attractive to other beings. It was for use on prey, not on friends. Lorcan Hardwick watched the girl and vented his frustrations by absent-mindedly shredding a flyer in his hands. The flyer was one of the posters for the new opening of the cafe that Aunt Adele had distributed around the place. She had put fresh flowers on each table too, and white tablecloths. Overhead she had created a chandelier of pastel balloons, from which streaming ribbons were gently dangling. It was a shame the place was almost empty. For her, not for me. I was glad of it. When I went to take their orders, they asked for a vanilla mille-feuille, a slice of passion and white chocolate mousse cake, and 2 slices of the baked vanilla cheesecake. With the special berry compote, the gorgeous girl said, looking at me anxiously to make sure I had heard this part. I smiled and reassured her that I would bring the compote. It had Aunt Adele's famous perk-me-up potion syrup in it. "Oh, good," she said, bouncing a little in her seat. "This guy has been telling me about it all morning." She playfully patted Oberon's forearm, and he grinned adoringly. Oberon ordered the double chocolate fudge cake for himself, the same one that I had just had for brunch myself. Good choice, I said. Hey, you're Esme Westbrim, aren't you? He said. My smile went rigid. Darn it, how the heck did he know? And why did he have to say it out loud? I shrugged, not wanting to confirm it. Lorcan Hardwick's head had whipped around to look at me, and narrowed when he saw me shrug. He glared at my hair as if I had dyed it on purpose to mislead him. Oberon had not noticed my change of mood. He was looking at Aunt Adele's decorations with appreciation. So you inherited the place from Dell, huh? He said. Good for you. Lorcan looked astonished and then very annoyed. Oberon noticed. He burst into laughter and then punched Lorcan good-naturedly on the arm. I bet you wanted it for yourself, didn't you, buddy? He said. But you can hardly blame the old bird for leaving it to her own family. He turned to me. Lorcan is... I know, I said. Alaric Hardwick was his great-uncle. Lorcan had been related to Aunt Adele's husband in the same way that I was related to Aunt Adele. Maybe if the old man had outlasted his wife, he would have left the crumbling old pile to Lorcan, huh? Said Oberon. Lorcan always was his favourite. Oberon's eyes crinkled with mirth as he contemplated the sour expression on his friend's face. Ha ha, said Lorcan, not smiling. Chill out, said Oberon. It's not like you need it. He turned to me suddenly. Not that I'm implying you need it either. As if calling a person poor was the worst thing you could call them. I had been poor for many years in my life. That's what happened when you left home at 18 with no real life skills. I refused to be ashamed of it. I shrugged. Oberon extended his hand for me to shake. I'm Oberon Malte Jr., I said. I know. It seemed I remembered rather more about this town than I had thought. You can leave Brimstone Bay, but the bay never leaves you, Oberon said with a warm smile. His hand that I was shaking was warm too. Warmer than mine, anyhow. Funny, since he was the vampire. I quickly pulled my hand away. The sunlight seemed to not affect him at all, I noted enviously. Maybe it was a dampire thing, I thought, to have warm blood pumping through their veins. They were incredibly rare. I had never met another, let alone shook their hand. The long-faced succubus was looking at me and Oberon with pursed lips, as if she didn't like our banter. Not that she had any reason to be worried for her girlfriend. Oberon clearly only had eyes for the gorgeous girl, who Oberon promptly told me was called Lily Silverswift. He introduced the Baena twins too. They were Petra and Paolo Ambers. I nodded in recognition. The Ambers were a quite prominent Baena family in the town. I'm hungry, Petra complained, and glared at me in a way that made it clear that she expected me to be a good little waitress and scurry off to get their cakes. There was no need for me to do this, since Aunt Adele must have been spying on us. She now swept into the cafe carrying an enormous tray heaving under the weight of the cakes and an enormous teapot and cups. The girls exclaimed appreciatively over the cakes, and Lily even clapped her hands when she saw the little jugs of winter berry compote. This put a big smile on Aunt Adele's face. I helped her unload everything onto the table while Oberon grinned unashamedly at Aunt Adele's disguise. If you hadn't floated in, he teased her, I'd have thought you were alive for sure. Shut up, Oberon, said Lorcan. Oberon reached out to pat Aunt Adele's hand, and did not flinch from the icy blast of cold he must have felt. He winked at her. I never dared tell you this when you were alive, because Lorcan would have thought I was going after his granny, but these purple robes of yours always were my favourite. You look as delicious as these cakes. She pinched his cheek fondly. Oberon Jr., you always were a cheeky little rascal. She poured them all cups of steaming hot tea and poured me a cup too. I've brought you a slice of the red velvet cake to try, she said, placing it in front of an empty chair at the table. I shook my head.
I'll eat in the kitchen, I told her lightly, wanting to scurry away from the unpleasant burn of the sunlight and trying to hide it. These guys didn't come here to eat with me. And more importantly, I didn't much want to eat with them. I had secrets to hide where sharp eyes would not notice them, especially a dampire's. But Oberon insisted on my joining them, and I found myself acquiescing. Maybe I would learn something from him, like what ambient magic he'd been born with that made him not shrivel into a pile of sunburnt blisters. I was surprised how pleasant their company turned out to be. After she had eaten her cake, even Petra Amber's lightened up. The five happily told me about themselves. Oberon, Lorcan, Petra, and Paolo had known each other their whole lives and took much pleasure in ribbing each other. Much of their chatter was about how things in town were looking up now that the new mayor had been elected. Mayor Blaze had promised improvements. They were especially looking forward to this year's winter festivities. I bit my tongue. Antioch Blaze, the new mayor, was not someone I admired. The quicker his term was over, the better, in my opinion. Lily and I exchanged a glance. I had a feeling she was thinking the same. She rolled her eyes at her friends. "Gosh, guys," she said, "just because Antioch Blaze is famous, there's no need to be drooling over him." I took a sip of tea to disguise my smile. She might be the youngest, but she had her head screwed on straight. It turned out the lovely Lily Silverswift was new to town and was a witch. I was a bit taken aback by this news. Witches did not date vampires. It was not approved of, and clearly she had something going on with Oberon. She eyed me up to see whether I was judging her, and I quickly gave her a smile, because who was I to judge? She seemed to relax. "Is it true you have magic wild pink hair?" she said, wistfully, looking at my brunette locks as if she wished I would change them back so that she could see. The Magic Wild was the world from which all magic came, an incredible place of great fascination to us witches and wizards. It was very difficult to get to, needing powerful magic to cross through the ether into it. "It's true," I said. "Wow! I always was so curious about Brimstone Bay," she said. Her high voice was as silvery as her name. It reminded me a little of a ringing bell. "Mum and Dad preferred to take us to Magic Wild Market in London when we needed to buy things, and we always holidayed abroad, so they never brought me here when I was little. So me and my friends came together this summer. I loved it so much, I ended up staying." She spoke, all in a rush, and I could see now that she was barely 20. It seemed practically a baby to me now that I was past the wrong side of 35, as my mum liked to say. "Speaking of your friends," said Oberon darkly. He was looking towards the cafe door. Lily looked in that direction and her face fell. "What is he doing here?" she said, sounding upset. Outside, a young man was walking down the path towards the cafe. She stood up and rushed to intercept him, but he had already opened the door and come in. I took him in with a single glance and quietly asked, "Werewolf?" to Oberon. He nodded. I was relieved, because at least I wouldn't have to persuade Aunt Adele to leave. She looked like she was having far too much fun watching Oberon and his friends to be persuaded to go quietly. Oberon's eyes were fixed on Lily and the newcomer, who were whispering furiously at each other over by the door. Lily was trying to push the guy out, but he was refusing to leave. Oberon looked envious. I hardly thought that Oberon had anything to worry about. The Dampire was classically handsome with his dark hair and jewel bright eyes. The new guy was only averagely good-looking in a rough and rugged way. His shaggy brown hair could have done with a cut. "Who is he?" I asked Oberon. "Her ex," he said shortly. "James." Oberon, Lorcan and Paolo all looked annoyed at this James. Even Petra was watching the arguing couple with narrowed eyes. "Stupid git," she muttered. "Can't he take a hint, trying to drag her home as if she was a piece of meat?"
Why did they break up? I asked curiously. She came here and found someone better, said Petra, her eyes flicking to Oberon. James left, but I'm not surprised he's come back. She always did say he was too possessive. The new guy, James, had taken a very firm grip on Lily's arm and was trying to drag her out of the cafe, but she was refusing to go. Oberon rose to his feet, anger on his face. You stay right where you are, said Aunt Adele anxiously. I won't tolerate fisticuffs in my cafe. Oberon did not sit down. He looked torn, like he hated seeing James's hands on Lily, but he wasn't too sure whether Lily would want him to intercede. Go, Lily was yelling now. I don't care if you've got nowhere to stay. You shouldn't have come. Don't mess me around, Lily, shouted James, his face red. Stop being a brat or I'll... You'll what? She shoved him hard on the chest. He was a big guy, and it didn't do more than make him take a single step backwards. Get lost! You can sleep on the damn beach with your stupid cats, she yelled. I don't want you here. You're not staying, he snarled. I won't let you. His hand tightened around her wrist. She yelped. He wrenched open the door and started dragging her out. Oberon moved fast towards them, and I ran after him. The look on his face alarmed me. He looked like he was going to kill someone, and no way was I going to let him make that kind of mistake. But Oberon was a vampire and faster than me. He was nearly at James. His hands reached for James's throat. He snarled. I saw his fangs, and the next thing I knew, I had whipped my wand out and there was a blast. Glass smashed. Lily screamed. James went flying out of the now shattered cafe door. Looking stunned, he picked himself up. His eyes were black with anger. He was holding his chest. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You, he snarled. You don't know what you're messing with. Go away, James, Lily screamed, her voice high with panic. James's eyes dropped to my wand and his gaze turned wary. Then he looked at Lily almost accusingly. Stay here in this stupid place then, he yelled furiously. You'll regret it. He stalked off. You crazy witch, Lily screamed at me. What the heck is wrong with you? I wanted to explain that I'd been trying to help, but my mouth was gaping open. I was flabbergasted by what I had done. Don't you even think about it, young lady, said Aunt Adele to Lily, because Lily had her own wand in her hand now and she was pointing it at me. How would you like it if I did that to you? She screeched. I took a step back. I didn't even know how I had done it. I hadn't meant to. Never in my wildest dreams had it occurred to me that that might happen. She stabbed her wand towards me, her mouth opening to say an incantation to hex or curse me. I lifted my wand too, but I knew there was nothing I could do. I couldn't repeat what I had done. I didn't know how. I was lucky no one had been hurt. Lily's fierce look hardened to resolution. I braced to leap out of the way. Aunt Adele plucked Lily's wand out of her hand. The girl cried out in anger and wrenched her wand back. She screamed then because it broke. Looking on the verge of tears, she turned tail and chased James out of the cafe. Her friends all followed her. I wish I could say that was the last I saw of her, but it was not. That poor girl, said Aunt Adele. I'll have to pay to get her a new wand. I do hope they come back. It wasn't your fault, I said. You didn't break it. Oberon and his friends were the only visitors who came to the cafe that day, much to Aunt Adele's disappointment. After dark, she hung up the closed sign on the cafe and took me up to the south tower. She made a room up for me, putting fresh sheets on the bed and lighting scented candles and fussing while I unpacked my meagre belongings. You'll get some privacy here, she said. My room is in the north tower, so you'll not find me over this way much.
Before I went to bed that evening, she admonished me for staying indoors all day and said that I had better go to town tomorrow and hand out some of her flyers. She had not gone to all this trouble to reopen the cafe for nothing. I didn't much feel like explaining to her why I had no intention of going out in the daytime, so I kept quiet. She went to bed after feeding me a delicious dinner for which I was most grateful, and I went to bed too. Instead of going up to my tower, I ended up snuggling in the couch in the lounge, tucked into a warm blanket before the roaring fire, sipping at the cup of hot cocoa I had been craving. I found myself vaguely thinking that maybe life in Brimstone Bay could be good for me. I would not have to live with my family anymore. It was lovely here with Aunt Adele. If only I could find a way to keep my secret. I let myself indulge in that train of thought for a little while before putting a stop to it. No, 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 I told myself. Brimstone Bay was the most dangerous place in the world for someone like me. A town full of witches and wizards? I'd be lucky to last a week. I was here to find a cure, and please, Goddess, let there be one. And then I was going straight back to London. I was going to charge into the apartment and pack up all of my worldly belongings and half of Drew's most precious things too, just to spite him, like that noisy golden cuckoo clock on the mantelpiece that I always hated, but which he insisted was a family heirloom. While I did it, I would shout and rage at the top of my voice, because if there was one thing that Drew hated, it was for his posh neighbours to know his business. And then I would yell, "In your face, Drew Barrington Chumley II, husband of 3 weeks and total creep. I never wanted to marry you and your stupid name anyway," and drive away into the sunset with a sense of dignity and a fake fist pump of victory. Except I couldn't drive. I'd never needed to in London with its excellent public transport system. I'd worked from home most of the time anyway, as a real-life crime mystery blog writer, earning just enough to get by. Having a car in London had been too expensive for my budget. After moving in with Drew, I'd insisted on paying my fair share, so almost all of my earnings had gone towards the bills for his expensive apartment. Gosh, that was lame. I wasn't even going to be able to drive off into the sunset under my own steam. But this was a fantasy, damn it, and I could darn well drive off in it if I wanted to. Heck, if I was going to daydream about the impossible, I would ether hop away with a wave of my wand, and then I'd ether hop back to see the shock and astonishment on Drew and Sarah's stupid faces, and then I would point my wand at them and... No, I would never do that. Not even in my imagination. That way lay the slippery slope. I hated witches who resorted to using magic on humbuls, and I had known more than a few of that kind growing up in Brimstone Bay. I tried to drop off in my armchair, but my thoughts plagued me. I tossed and turned for hours. The fire was dying down, and it was growing chill. Outside, the night was calling to me, and my body did not want to sleep. It was a long time before I dropped off. I woke up several times to noises. Sometimes noises that I hoped were just the old castle settling in the dark. Sometimes the noises of what Aunt Adele had told me were the fairies and gnomes making war in the garden. One time it was definitely the sounds of a person moving around. But when I went to investigate, wand uselessly but firmly clenched in my hand, it turned out to be Aunt Adele humming to herself and shifting crates of stuff around in the garden. It seemed I wasn't the only one who couldn't sleep. Not that ghosts really slept as far as I was aware. Their rest was of a different sort. Determined to stick to a nighttime sleeping routine, I returned to my armchair and firmly closed my eyes. The next time I woke, something cold was nuzzling my nose. I gave a yelp of fright when I saw 2 shiny green eyes looking at me in the semi-darkness. It was a moment before I realised who it was, and I chuckled. "Captain Villain, is that you?" He meowed as if to say, "Of course it's me, you fool of a witch." Captain Villain had been my favourite of the cats in Kitten Cove when I was young. I had named him Captain Villain because he was always turning up wherever there was a spot of trouble. "Gosh, I'm glad you're still alive," I murmured. "You must be pretty old now, huh, fella?" He made an almost snorting sound as if to tell me he most certainly was not old. I stroked his silky black fur. He was almost indistinguishable from the darkness. He was perched on the back of the couch. When he patted my cheek with his paw, I felt a smear of wetness left behind. I knew what it was immediately. I could smell it, that sharp iron tang. I sat bolt upright. I didn't want to smell it. My stomach roiled. No, actually it growled, loudly. "Darn it," I said to him quietly. "How did you get that stuff on you? You know I'm going to have to wash it off, don't you?" I lifted him up gingerly, not wanting to get any of the stuff on myself, and carried him out into the garden to hose him down, though I knew he would hate that. And that was when I saw Lily Silverswift again. Only this time, she was no longer alive.